Italy didn't wait to collapse. While France burned, Sweden fragmented, and Belgium surrendered its suburbs, Italy watched. And then it acted. No more veils in public. No more foreign money building radical mosques. No more excuses for forced marriages and cultural enclaves that defy Italian law. Because Italy saw what other nations refused to admit, that multiculturalism without integration becomes a slow-motion suicide. Now, Italy is drawing a line in the sand, not against Islam, but against the collapse of national unity. And what's most shocking? They might be the first Western country to actually prevent it. Let's break down exactly what Italy did, how far it went, and why this may be Europe's last warning. April 2022. Sweden's prime minister stands before cameras with a confession that shocks the nation. Magdalena Andersson admitted that the Scandinavian country has failed. Segregation has been allowed to go so far that we now have parallel societies. We live in the same country, but in completely different realities. 2 decades, 20 years of watching communities form that answer to different laws, different values, different loyalties. Sweden's foreign-born population had doubled in 20 years. 1 in 5 Swedes now born outside the country, and by the time leaders admitted the truth, over 100 police officers had been injured in riots triggered by a single Quran burning. Gang violence had turned Swedish cities into war zones, bombings, shootings, entire neighborhoods where emergency services required armed police escorts, areas where Swedish law meant nothing and clan justice meant everything. The damage was done. France had an even bloodier reckoning. In October 2020, a teacher named Samuel Paty showed cartoons of Muhammad in a classroom discussion about free speech. Days later, he was beheaded on a Paris street by an 18-year-old who'd been radicalized through social media and mosque networks. The killer's family had been in France for years, integrated, everyone assumed. But when the moment came, he chose a different allegiance. Not to France, not to French values, to an ideology that demanded blood for blasphemy. And France erupted, not just in grief, but in fury at what decades of accommodation had built. The banlieues, the suburban enclaves surrounding Paris and other cities, had become no-go zones where French police feared to patrol, where Islamic religious law governed family disputes outside any court system, where women disappeared behind veils and walls, cut off from French society entirely. In 2011, France had been the first Western nation to ban the burqa in public spaces. The law passed with overwhelming support, but enforcement was spotty at best, and the parallel societies kept growing. Belgium and Molenbeek, a Brussels neighborhood that became Europe's jihadi factory. The November 2015 Paris attackers that killed 130 people came from there. The March 2016 Brussels airport bombers lived there. Even the 2014 Jewish museum killer had ties to Molenbeek networks. Intelligence agencies knew about the radicalization, knew about the foreign-funded mosques, knew about the imams preaching separation and violence, knew about the young men watching ISIS propaganda in internet cafes and basement prayer rooms. But political leaders did nothing, called it tolerance, called it diversity, called it respecting religious freedom, called anyone raising alarms a racist or an Islamophobe, until the bombs went off, until the bullets tore through concert halls and cafes, until body counts forced them to admit what they'd known all along. You cannot have 2 societies operating under different laws in the same territory. One will dominate, or both will collapse into violence. Italy watched all of this unfold, watched its neighbors make the same mistakes over and over. Accommodation without assimilation, tolerance without integration, freedom without responsibility. And Italian leaders ask themselves a simple question. What did these countries see that they ignored? What warning signs did they dismiss as paranoia or racism or Islamophobia right up until it was too late to stop? Here's what Italy realized. This wasn't about hating Islam. This wasn't even about immigration, really. This was about something far more dangerous. The quiet replacement of national law with foreign ideology. The slow formation of societies within societies. The patient construction of parallel power structures that owe no loyalty to the nation they inhabit. Italy looked at France, Sweden, Belgium, and saw the pattern clearly. And they decided, Not here, not ever. But here's what makes Italy's response so shocking. They didn't just talk about it. They didn't form committees or launch studies or debate it for another decade. They acted. October 2025. Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni's Brothers of Italy party introduces legislation to parliament that makes every other European nation look timid by comparison. A nationwide ban on the burqa and niqab in all public spaces, not just government buildings, not just schools, everywhere. Streets, shops, offices, universities, public transit, parks, cafes, anywhere citizens interact. Everywhere citizens interact, faces must be visible. The fines? 300 to 3,000 euros. For context, France's burqa fine maxes out around 150 euros. Italy's penalties are 20 times higher for repeat offenders. That's not a symbolic slap on the wrist, that's a statement. We are serious. This is non-negotiable. Violate this law and it will cost you. But the face veil ban is just the opening move. The bill goes after the infrastructure of separatism itself. Any religious organization in Italy without a formal state agreement, which currently includes all Muslim associations since Islam lacks official recognition from the Italian state, must now declare every source of funding, every donation, every grant, every wire transfer from abroad. Foreign money for mosques? Banned outright if it comes from governments deemed a threat to Italian security or social cohesion. Saudi Arabia has spent billions building Wahhabist mosques across Europe. Qatar funds cultural centers that spread Muslim Brotherhood ideology. Turkey, under Erdogan, uses religious institutions to project power and influence across the continent. Italy just cut the pipeline, and the bill doesn't stop there. It strikes at practices that had been whispered about in immigrant communities but rarely confronted by authorities. Forced marriage, where families coerce daughters into unions they don't choose. Virginity testing, the degrading and invasive procedure used to control women's bodies and sexuality. Cultural coercion disguised as religious tradition, where community pressure enforces behavior that violates individual freedom. All now criminal offenses with specific enhanced penalties. No exceptions, no cultural justifications, no religious exemptions. If you force a woman to marry against her will in Italy, you're going to face increased penalties. The fact that your religion or culture permits it means nothing. Italian law applies to everyone, or it applies to no one. Sara Kalani, who heads immigration policy for Brothers of Italy, framed it simply. In Italy, we apply our laws which are based on a specific set of values. Not negotiable values, not flexible values, not values that bend to accommodate every cultural practice imported from elsewhere. Italian values in Italy. Andrea Del Mastro, one of the lawmakers who drafted the legislation, put it perfectly. Religious freedom is sacred, but it must be exercised in the open, in full respect of our Constitution and the principles of the Italian state. Read that again. Religious freedom is sacred. Italy isn't banning Islam, isn't shutting down mosques, isn't forcing conversions. But freedom has boundaries, and those boundaries are Italian law, Italian values, and Italian sovereignty. Pray in private however you want, worship as your faith demands, but step into public life and you're Italian first. That's the deal. That's the contract, and Italy just made it crystal clear. Now here's where it gets even more intense, because this law isn't just about clothing or funding transparency. It's about dismantling something most Europeans don't even realize exists: the political infrastructure of Islamism. Let's be precise about what that means. There's Islam, the religion, private faith, personal spirituality. Millions of Muslims across Europe practice it peacefully, contribute to society, raise families, build businesses. They're doctors, teachers, entrepreneurs. They vote, pay taxes, serve in the military. Then there's political Islam, the ideology that says Islamic law, Sharia, should govern not just personal worship but public life, family law, criminal justice, government itself. The movement that rejects secular democracy and works patiently, systematically, to replace it with religious governance. That's what Italy is targeting. That's what makes this legislation so much more than a culture war. Prime Minister Meloni made this distinction years ago, and now she's turning her words into policy. In a 2018 video that resurfaced recently and went viral, she was blunt. There is compatibility problem between Islamic culture or a certain interpretation of Islamic culture and the rights and values of our civilization. Not Islam broadly, not all Muslims, certain interpretations. The ones that demand women cover completely in public. The ones that justify forced marriage as a religious duty. The ones that refuse to accept equality under the law as principle. The ones that tell adherents their primary loyalty is to Ummah, the global Muslim community, not to the nation where they live. These aren't fringe positions confined to extremist websites. They're preached in mosques across Europe, taught in Islamic schools, reinforced through community pressure. And here's the mechanism they've been using to spread: foreign funding. For decades, wealthy Gulf states and Turkey have financed the construction of grand mosques across Europe, not as charity, as influence operations, as soft power projection, and ideological colonization. They build the mosque. They pay the imam's salary. They provide the curriculum for attached schools. They fund the cultural centers that become social hubs. And in return, they control the message. These mosques become gathering points, places where young men hear that Western values are corrupt and Islam alone offers truth, where women are told submission to male authority is divinely mandated, where families are counseled that Western education threatens their children's souls, where the message, subtle or explicit, is always the same: you're Muslim first, European never. Austria figured this out in 2018. Chancellor Sebastian Kurz, leading a center-right government, shut down 7 mosques and expelled dozens of imams tied to foreign funding. He banned the Turkish Islamic Union for Cultural and Social Cooperation, known as ATİB, which had been operating 60 mosques across Austria under direct Turkish government control. Kurz's statement at the time was unequivocal: parallel societies, political Islam, and tendencies towards radicalization have no place in our country. Turkey's government exploded in fury, called it racist, called it Islamophobic. Erdogan himself condemned Austria, but Austria held firm, and the mosques stayed closed. Italy just took that model, studied what worked, and supercharged it with nationwide application and transparent enforcement mechanisms. Every mosque, every Islamic cultural center, every religious school. If you want to operate in Italy, your funding is transparent, your sources are vetted. Your teachings must respect Italian constitutional principles, and if you're being bankrolled by a foreign government trying to export its ideology, shut down. But here's what nobody expected. Italy was about to discover just how right they were to act when they did, because while they were drafting this legislation, intelligence agencies were quietly disrupting something terrifying. In 2023 and 2024, Italian and European security services broke up multiple radicalization networks operating across the country. Foreign-funded cells, online recruitment, individuals on the path to violence, inspired by propaganda flowing through precisely the kind of parallel structures Italy is now legislating against. The details remain classified, but what's public is chilling enough. Italy was months, maybe weeks away from discovering whether its existing laws were strong enough to stop an attack. And the answer appeared to be no. The surveillance that caught these threats, the monitoring that identified the networks, the intelligence cooperation that dismantled the cells before they could act, all of it depended on tools and authorities that Italy's new legislation now codifies and expands. This wasn't theory. This wasn't politicians scaremongering about hypothetical dangers. This was inches from bloodshed, from headlines screaming about another European city attacked, from funerals and vigils and the same useless cycle of grief and outrage and inaction. Italy's aggressive stance, the one critics called Islamophobic, the one Brussels condemns as extremist, it might have just saved lives. But validation doesn't equal acceptance. And Italy's decision to act decisively triggered exactly the backlash you'd expect. The European Union was furious. Brussels, built on multiculturalism and open borders and tolerance above all, couldn't accept that a member state would explicitly reject those principles and choose national unity over diversity. The condemnations came fast. Human rights groups called the legislation discriminatory. Media outlets labeled it far-right extremism, Islamophobia, racism, fascism. International Muslim organizations condemned Italy. Turkey's government called it an attack on religious freedom. And Italy's response? Our country, our laws. Meloni's government didn't apologize, didn't walk it back, didn't soften the language. They doubled down because Italian citizens overwhelmingly supported this, not from hatred, from belief that public life requires certain shared norms. You want to be part of Italian society? Show your face. Follow Italian law. Respect Italian values. That's not extremism. That's sovereignty. And while Brussels fumed and activists organized protests, something unexpected started happening across Europe. Other nations began paying attention. France, still reeling from years of riots and terrorism, started moving aggressively toward Italy's model. In 2020, Macron passed laws against what France explicitly called Islamist separatism, tightening rules on homeschooling to prevent parallel Islamic education, restrictions on foreign funding for mosques, requirements that religious associations sign a charter upholding Republican values. Now French lawmakers are proposing even tougher measures: more surveillance of mosques, stricter integration requirements, faster deportations for anyone preaching separatism. Denmark went even further with what they call the Ghetto Package. Launched in 2024, it targets immigrant-heavy neighborhoods with mandatory integration programs. Danish children in these areas must attend state-approved daycares for at least 25 hours per week to learn Danish culture and values. Religious schools face district government oversight. Buildings in designated ghetto areas can be demolished to break up ethnic enclaves. The message is clear. If you live in Denmark, you will become Danish, not hyphenated, not parallel, Danish. Sweden, after decades of denial while gang violence consumed its city, finally acknowledged reality in November 2025. The government appointed an official inquiry specifically to study and combat what they now officially call parallel social structures, clan-based networks, family systems operating outside Swedish law, religious enclaves rejecting integration. The inquiry's mandate explicitly states these parallel societies undermine the rule of law, threaten democracy, and hamper integration. 20 years too late, Sweden admits what Italy saw from the beginning. 20 years of bloodshed and bombings and burned cars that could have been prevented if Swedish leaders had acted when the warnings were still whispers instead of screams. Even traditionally liberal nations are shifting. The Netherlands tightened citizenship requirements and expanded burqa bans. Switzerland held a referendum in 2021 where voters approved the nationwide face covering ban by 51%. Bulgaria implemented restrictions. Spain is debating them. Across the continent, the consensus that dominated European politics for half a century is shattering. The idea that absolute tolerance is the highest virtue, that nations have no right to define their own character, that integration is optional and assimilation is oppression. The European consensus that dominated for decades, the one that said absolute tolerance was the highest virtue, is cracking. In its place, a new consensus is forming. Integration is not optional. National unity is not negotiable. Sovereignty means something, and Italy lit the fuse. So what's the real lesson here? And why should anyone outside Europe care about Italian immigration law? Because what's happening in Italy isn't just about Muslims or mosques or veils or immigration policy. It's about whether nations have the right and the will to define themselves, whether citizens can demand shared values in public spaces, whether countries can survive when large segments of the population refuse to integrate into a common national project, whether civilization itself can be preserved, or whether it fragments into tribal warfare dressed up as tolerance. These are questions every Western nation will face. Many already are facing them, right now, in real time. Italy's choice was stark and simple. Pay a small price now or a catastrophic price later. Act decisively while the social fabric is still intact, or wait helplessly until it's torn beyond any hope of repair. Choose uncomfortable action when it's unpopular, or accept paralysis that guarantees collapse. History is littered with civilizations that failed this test, that chose comfort over survival, that mistook weakness for virtue. The Roman Empire didn't fall to barbarian invasions alone, despite what the history books suggest. It collapsed because internal cohesion dissolved first, because different peoples within the empire stopped seeing themselves as Roman and started identifying primarily as Goth, Vandal, Hun, or dozens of other tribal identities, because loyalty to creed and clan trumped loyalty to the state. By the time Alaric sacked Rome in 410 AD, the empire was already dead. The physical destruction just made it official. The Weimar Republic in Germany fell to the Nazis not because Hitler had an army, but because German society had fractured into hostile camps that refused to cooperate. Communists fought monarchists, fought liberals, fought fascists. No shared values, no common ground, no nation, really, just competing factions inhabiting the same territory. When a society reaches that point, someone will fill the vacuum. Usually someone with authoritarian answers and violent methods. Arnold Toynbee, who spent his life studying why civilizations rise and fall, put it perfectly. Civilizations die from suicide, not by murder. They rot from within. They fragment along cultural, religious, and ideological lines. They tolerate separation until separation becomes secession. They accommodate parallel structures until those structures replace the original. And by the time leaders realize what's happening, it's too late to stop the disintegration. Italy looked at that history, looked at its neighbors stumbling toward the abyss and said, "Not us, not on our watch, not while we still have the strength to act." And here's what makes this urgent for everyone watching, especially Americans sitting comfortably across the Atlantic thinking this is Europe's problem. The same dynamics playing out in Italy and France and Sweden are already present in the United States. Different scale, different specifics, different communities. But the same fundamental question: can a nation maintain unity when different groups live by fundamentally different values and refuse to assimilate into a shared national identity? When some communities reject integration entirely, when foreign governments and organizations fund infrastructure that promotes ideology over American identity, when religious law claims authority that conflicts with constitutional law, when certain enclaves operate by different rules than the rest of the country, when you have citizens who think of themselves as Muslim American or Chinese American or Mexican American, with the emphasis always on the first part and the hyphen doing all of the work of separating them for national unity. The question isn't whether America will face these tensions, it's when and whether American leaders will have the courage to act before crisis forces their hand. Italy's answer is clear. Draw the line now, enforce it consistently, accept the criticism, endure the backlash, because the alternative is watching your nation slowly cease to be a nation at all. France waited too long and paid in blood. Sweden waited too long and now governs parallel societies that may never integrate. Belgium waited too long and became a breeding ground for terrorism. Italy acted early, acted decisively, and whether you agree with every provision or not, the principle is undeniable. Nations that refuse to defend their cohesion will eventually lose it. So here's the question for you. Do you believe your country, wherever you live, has the right to demand integration? To insist that citizens share certain core values in public life? To enforce laws equally regardless of religious or cultural claims? Or do you think absolute tolerance, even tolerance of intolerance, even tolerance of separation is the higher principle? Italy made its choice. They chose survival. They chose unity. They chose to act while they still could. The rest of the Western world is watching, and sooner or later, every nation will face the same decision. Will they have the courage Italy showed, or will they wait until courage is no longer enough? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you believe this story matters, hit subscribe, because we're tracking the stories that define the future of nations, the ones mainstream media ignores until it's too late. This is Fall of Nations, and Italy just showed us what it looks like when a country refuses to fall.